All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to let a bunch of people come in while I go over to YouTube and get that set up. The people coming in, welcome, everyone. 1 second while I go to YouTube. Okay. For some reason, it's not letting me go to YouTube. Okay. Let's see here. Let me try that again. Okay, well, it's not letting me go to YouTube, which is fine. People over there won't be able to watch, but that's okay. Hello, everyone. Hello, people coming in. Helen, Jack, Kelly, Lewis, Michael, Mike, Roseanne, Shirley. We'll start in a couple minutes because I know there's other people that are going to be filtering in. But and tonight we're in Venice, which is always nice. So tonight we're going to be talking about vaccines. I'll obviously make reference to COVID vaccines, but it's going to be a general lecture about vaccines and also about what the public health suggestions are. I'm obviously, being a medical doctor, in favor generally of vaccines. What I'm usually not in favor of is public proclamations of trying to force people to get vaccines. I'll explain why that is, why I feel that way. But also I will explain to you in general terms why public health vaccine experts think that everyone should get vaccinated, so that you can understand that perspective. I know a lot of people who listen, who watch my stuff, I guess you could say, are very independent minded and want to make their own decisions. So I certainly am one to foster people being able to make educated decisions about themselves, whether they get vaccinated or not. I've chosen to get vaccinated. I got my second shot last Tuesday and was a little sick on last Wednesday night when we had the class. And if you think about it, as a physician, I waited quite a bit of time. I wanted to make sure that there were no negative side effects. And even my parents, who are in their late 70s and 80s, also waited because we wanted to see what type of potential side effects were showing up. We waited until there was a lot more data, but we all decided to get vaccinated. And I'll also talk about why I made that decision and why I decided that I think it is a good idea for most people to get vaccinated. But during this process, I got sent a lot of videos by people asking me to make comments on certain certain videos that were sent that really talk about vaccines, some in a very positive light, some in a very negative light. And then probably a week and a half ago, I heard an interview, a podcast. The podcast is by Dr. Peter Attia, which is a very good podcast. He interviews people in depth, and he spoke to a Dr. Paul Offit, who is a pediatrician at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. He created a vaccine for a certain type of diarrhea in kids that has saved thousands upon thousands of lives. I tend to not like the man only because every time he is brought on to discuss things like nutritional supplementation, he always is against nutritional supplementation. And this really comes down to this idea of people who are really involved in public health versus personalized health. People who are interested in personalized health suggestions, generally speaking, are going to be able to see the benefit of specific supplements for people in very specific conditions. When you're looking at everyone from a 30,000 foot view, then some of the impacts of certain supplements don't look significant enough to make widespread recommendations. But for almost every individual, you can find certain things that would improve with certain types of supplementation. So every time he's on, it's also, there are different types of medical literature. There's literature that speaks about nutritional interventions and disease interventions. So there's medical literature and there's nutritional literature. And both of these, unfortunately, you would think that all medical literature, all health literature sort of merges into one and everyone is sort of familiar with everything going on. But that actually isn't the case. There is a parallel nutritional literature in very well-respected journals that comes up with very different types of conclusions um, about overall health in terms of the impact of nutrition. And then on the other end, on the other side, in parallel, you have a whole medical literature that is evolving in such a way that, of course, is mostly focused on looking at drug interventions and then comparing drug interventions to supplement or nutritional, and that is not necessarily the right way to compare it, because they don't do that in the nutritional side of the literature. And there's really robust and amazing research coming out all the time talking about lifestyle interventions that make huge impacts in people's health, as well as selected personalized supplement suggestions. So anyway, every time Dr. Offit is on major media, and he is on major media all the time, when he's brought on to talk about that sort of thing, it really, really bothers me. But ultimately, he is obviously tied to the vaccine world, which means not just research, but also connections to vaccine makers, most likely. But he's still an expert when it comes to vaccines. And anyway, he was on Dr. Peter Attia's podcast. The podcast is called The Drive. It's a podcast I recommend. And it was really a great conversation. I sent it to a bunch of people afterwards. And then they sent me an email back and they said it was just a little too complicated for me. And, with one person suggesting that maybe I try to make a sort of summary of some of the things that are going on in terms of vaccines. So that's the origin of tonight's episode 60. So let me share my screen. Hopefully we're not having trouble with that. Okay, looks like we are having a little trouble with Zoom tonight. Okay, there we go. Okay. You should be able to see my screen. Let me know if you can see my screen. I am having a little bit of trouble tonight with Zoom. If you can see my screen, type into the chat box that you can. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so tonight we are going to break down this talk into some various different categories. We're going to start out talking about the different types of vaccines. Then we'll have just a very brief comment about how to assess long-term effects. And specifically, is there going to be an effect, next year or 2 years from now, some bizarre thing happen longer term. Then we're going to go a little bit doing a deep dive into understanding how researchers look at the numbers, because I think it's pretty revelatory for people who don't really understand when they say something like, this vaccine is 94% effective. What do they actually mean by that? And I think you'll actually be surprised. I know you'll be surprised, because it's not calculated the way you would actually think. Not that it's calculated in any deceptive way. A lot of people in the sort of community of people who are into conspiracies and against all conventional medicine often use this to say that, they're kind of pulling the wool over your eyes. But when we go through this, I hope you'll see that it's just the way that numbers are looked at when it comes to medical research. And then we'll talk about what the public policy experts have to say about what public health experts, what are they saying about what the policy should be? In short, of course, many of them want everyone to be vaccinated. And I want you to understand where they're coming from, even if I might not share that view. All right, so we're going to break this down. Let's go into just starting talking about the different types of vaccines. But first, let's define the target. So the target is that spike protein. And the virus basically has this spike protein around it. And it gets into the cell through this ACE2 receptor. And there are people who have certain genetic variations that actually will protect them from, not perfectly, but will reduce their risk for the vac for getting the coronavirus. And that actually can be tested. When I do nutrigenomic analyses and people do a swab and they send it into a lab and then I analyze the report for them, this is actually one of the things that's actually done. So you can actually find out if you have a variation in this receptor. So the target is always going to be trying to get your body to mount a response to, in this case, they've chosen the spike protein. Now, they could have chosen something else in the vaccine. It could have been some other protein that is in here. But generally speaking, this is the most obvious choice. This thing's sort of sticking out. And we want to present this spike protein to the body so that it recognizes it, processes it, and then gets rid of it. And that's basically what the target is going to be for the virus. Now, let's go through conventional vaccines and then the genetic vaccines. And of course, there's a lot of concern and a lot of worry about what is the nature of these genetic vaccines. Are they affecting our DNA? Is it going to be, are we going to turn into some kind of mutant in a year or two? How is it interacting, if at all, with actually our DNA? Because just because it's composed of things that are sort of genetic, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to interfere specifically with our DNA. So you'll understand a little bit about that. And then in general, we'll go into an understanding of really what's going on in terms of how these viruses are mutating and what the implications are for overall, coverage of vaccines. So conventional vaccines, we should actually start at the very bottom here, which would be a live non-human virus. Now this goes all the way back to smallpox. So smallpox was, a terrible thing that humans had to deal with. And what they found was that the milkmaids who were working on the cows who had cowpox weren't getting smallpox. And that's why they used to say something like, I can't remember the expression, but something was like, something they used to say like that milkmaids had, milky clear skin or something like that. And the reason is because the milkmaids never actually caught smallpox because there was a virus, in this case cowpox, that was close enough to smallpox that they were getting exposed and were developing immunity to smallpox. So whereas everyone else was getting smallpox and they had really pitted, terrible skin, the milkmaid skin was completely clear because they weren't catching, not all of them were catching smallpox. So Edward Jenner, the guy who came up with the smallpox vaccine, realized that there must be something going on here. And he then created the first vaccine, which was basically giving humans the cowpox vaccine, the virus, and that prevented them from getting the smallpox because it was similar, not exact, similar enough for the body to be able to create immunity to fight off smallpox. It's a really amazing story. Now, we're not using any non-human equivalents anymore, but that's sort of how the vaccine era started. He didn't know anything about viruses or anything of the sort. And then it moved on to isolating the virus, inactivating it, and then giving the virus, giving the inactivated virus so that the body could create an immune reaction to recognize it. And Louis Pasteur in France developed the rabies vaccine. This is sort of in the history of one of the major milestones of modern medicine, that Louis Pasteur created rabies, which is essentially a 100% fatal vaccine in fatal disease, in humans. And he was able to isolate from dogs the virus, kill it, and then inject it, and that would allow the body to be able to fight it not in getting infected because it's been inactivated. And then the body would create a response, and then you'd be able to fight the rabies vaccine if you were to get the rabies virus if you were to get an infection. Currently, in China and in Russia, the two vaccines that you hear being used for COVID around the world from China and from Russia are not these genetic vaccines that we'll talk about. They're actually whole inactivated viruses. So in Brazil, I believe they're using the China vaccine. Actually, all over the world, and it often is based on sort of regional alliances and political ties. The depending on what country. So there are some nationalist issues going into who's getting what vaccine. But it's good to know that even for COVID, there are different types of vaccines that are out there. And in this case, for China and Russia, they're both using whole inactivated viruses. Then there's another type of vaccine that's called live attenuated. So it's basically a live virus that's made weaker and then is injected. So it's weak enough that you won't get the infection, but it allows your body to be able to create the antibodies to be able to fight that. So the common MMR is a live attenuated vaccine. Then we have a purified protein vaccine. So in other words, all of these things are different ways of exposing your body to either the virus itself, either alive, killed, or attenuated, made weaker, or taking a protein from the virus. Like, for example, it could be maybe they would be able to isolate that spike protein and just inject the spike protein. I'm not sure if that's what they're doing with Novavax, which is another COVID vaccine that they are experimenting with that is based on this theory of vaccine, where you're not giving a virus, you're not giving a killed virus, you're not giving an attenuated virus, but you're giving a protein that then your body is going to react to. In this case, think about it being the spike protein that we spoke about. And then when the spike protein is, your body sees it as part of the virus, it knows what part of it is and is therefore able to attack that whole thing and get rid of it. And hepatitis B virus is also an example of a purified protein as well. So this is sort of an analysis of the history of vaccines in general. Okay, so now we have a basic understanding of some of the viruses. Now, let's go to the so-called genetic vaccines. And before we get into that, there are a couple general concepts that I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. So please don't be scared by some of these images. What I just want to focus on really here is, so this is a cell. And in the cell, we have a nucleus here in the middle. And we have this little thing called the nucleolus that's creating what are called ribosomes, which are out here. Now, the easiest thing and here are the mitochondria, we've spoken about that. These are the little powerhouses of the cell. And the nucleus here carries our DNA, all the genetic information. And what happens is messages are sent out from the DNA into these ribosomes. And I want you to see how the ribosomes are outside of the nucleus. They're in what's called the cytoplasm. They're sort of like floating sort of inside this ball that has all of these other things in it. It's really, I mean, when you think about the world of the cell and how incredibly, complex and how much of a symphony of things that's going on, it's truly a miracle. It really is, to think that every cell in your body has variations on what you're seeing in front of you. It's an incredible thing. So the DNA is by itself in this nucleus. Now I'm going to go up here, and it's sort of blowing up what's happening in the nucleus. So the nucleus is here, okay? And what's happening is the DNA, which is here, the DNA does many things, but one of the things it wants to do is create proteins. And it has messages, basically codes in the DNA that need to be transcribed. And what happens is what is what's called mRNA, messenger RNA is formed. Now this messenger RNA sort of goes out into that floating area to the ribosome. And the ribosome is kind of like a assembly factory. In other words, it gets the message that is, here's the message. It's all these different letters, and it truly is, one of four letters that is it's sort of on like a ticker with a certain sequence of letters, and it hits the ribosome, and it instructs the ribosome according to the letters to create a certain set of amino acids. So in other words, messages sent from the nucleus by something called messenger RNA out to the ribosome, sitting in the cytoplasm, floating out there outside the nucleus, creates that protein, and then that protein goes on to do what it's supposed to do. And in this case, the vaccine is creating the spike protein using your ribosomes to create the spike protein, and then it's sending that protein to be displayed out on the cells in your body, which then your body can then react to. That's for the mRNA vaccine. So now we understand that the mRNA is something that's going on. It starts in the DNA and then goes here. But with the with the vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, it's just the mRNA. It's not involving the DNA. In fact, the mRNA is coming from outside. It's coming from the vaccine itself. So it never gets into the nucleus. In fact, it can't even get into the nucleus. It would require a signal to get into the nucleus. And then in order to get into the DNA, it will require an enzyme, specific enzyme, to be able to get into the DNA. So the messenger RNA vaccines are incapable of getting into your nucleus. And certainly, even if it was able to get into your nucleus, it wouldn't be able to get into your DNA. And the mRNA doesn't really last all that long. So you are just going to be displaying that spike protein for as long as the mRNA lasts, which is not very long. It's going to break down. And then, but hopefully by that time, your immune system has caught on. It's basically learned to recognize the spike protein so that if you're exposed to the spike protein, you can make a response. All right, so now you have a little bit of a better understanding, and we're going to review what I just spoke about as we get into talking about the mRNA vaccine in a little bit more depth. So we have technically we have two genetic, I guess you could say, vaccines. You have the mRNA vaccine from Moderna and Pfizer. I got the Moderna vaccine. And then you have what's called an adenovirus-based vaccine, which is J&J and AstraZeneca. Now, let's talk. So we have a basic understanding of what this mRNA vaccine is doing. In other words, it's not taking any mRNA from the nucleus. It's putting mRNA. It's like shortcutting, getting into your cell, going right to that ribosome to make the protein, which then puts it on the surface of the cell. Now, the adenovirus is a different type of thing. Adenovirus is like it's similar to a cold vaccine. I mean, sorry, a cold virus, and it is what they call replication defective. In other words, they've made the virus such that it can't replicate. Now, the adenovirus is going to function in an interesting way. It actually is capable of getting into the nucleus, but it lacks an enzyme to be able to get into the DNA. So what it's actually doing is the DNA of the virus of the adenovirus, which has been modified to have the genetic code of the spike protein, is getting into the nucleus and causing mRNA to form, which is then going to the ribosome and then creating the spike protein. So, so let's go through these a little bit because I made some notes on these, but you have a general basic understanding. Now let's reinforce what we just spoke about. So we've spoken about what mRNA is. It's messenger RNA that's going from the DNA in the nucleus out into the cytoplasm, into the ribosome, which is again creating this protein, which is then causing it to go into the cell membrane. So as I'm saying here, as I said before, it's just affecting the ribosome away from the nucleus. It can't replicate forever, so it doesn't last that long, and it can't get into your DNA because it doesn't have the signal protein. It's RNA, and the RNA, if it did get it, if there was some way that it could get into the DNA, it would then actually have to be converted from RNA to DNA, and then from the DNA, it would have to have an enzyme, which it doesn't have, to get into the DNA, to your DNA. So in other words, the chances are it's impossible for that to happen. So the mRNA vaccines are not to worry about in terms of causing you to have any sort of DNA. It's not affecting your DNA in any way. Now, it's interesting, right, that we have the Moderna and we have the J&J. Now, J&J is just one shot. Now, the reason it's one shot is because mRNA, as I told you before, it doesn't really last that long. It's not as stable as DNA, and it's just getting into the cytoplasm. The adenovirus vaccine is actually able to get into the nucleus. And when it gets into the nucleus, it actually sticks around a lot longer than it would if it was just RNA. Now, it's replication defective. It's made to be so. In other words, they take out a part of the DNA that would allow it to replicate, and then they put in the code for the spike protein. So the general principle is that it's like a Trojan horse. It's basically delivering the spike protein, in this case, the spike protein signal, letters, instructions, in place of the part of the DNA that would cause it to replicate and continue to grow in your cell. So it gets into the nucleus, but it doesn't get into your DNA because it doesn't have that enzyme that I spoke about before. But it sticks around a lot longer. So your cells actually display the spike protein a little bit longer, which is why you only need one shot. It allows your immune system to have more time to be exposed to the virus because your cells are creating that spike protein on the surface for a lot longer time, because the mRNA, it just doesn't stick around as long as the viral DNA. And so that's why. There were 6 clotting episodes in 6.9 million doses. Now it's a low risk, but obviously there were some side effects, but very, very, very low risk. But again, if you're one of those people, obviously it's significant. Okay, so we now have a general idea. I think you have a general idea of what these viruses, how these vaccines actually work, and how they are, how we're dealing with them when it comes to COVID. So we've got Moderna, and we've got Jen saying there are a lot more than just that amount in terms of the adenovirus vaccine. Could be. That's what I saw before I came on. So we have a general understanding here of the general layout of the vaccines. And that's really what I wanted to go over. As she's saying, there are many dozens in the EU. Of course, in the EU, they've made, I don't know how many vaccines that they gave in the EU, but that's good to know. So we have a general overview of adenovirus, mRNA, inactivated viruses, live attenuated, and purified protein. Okay. Now, when it comes to mutation of the viruses, some viruses are going to mutate slowly. So with flu, as an example, there's very, very fast mutation. COVID mutates, not as fast as the flu, but it's not as slow as measles, as an example. The measles has much less mutation. So the older vaccines, I keep on misplacing the words, less mutation. So older vaccines actually still work for measles. And that's why you're not, public health people are not suggesting that you need a new measles shot every year. So the goal of viral mutation in general for the virus is to become more contagious, not necessarily more virulent. And I think that the issue here is that as time goes by, we are going to have to deal with different variants, and it is actually not completely clear. Most experts say that we're going to need around 2 years to have a general idea of what kind of significant mutations there are. Now, when it comes to side effects, everything you're going to give people, they're going to be side effects. So the real distinction actually is, are there going to be side effects that we don't see right now in a year from now? And that's really the real question. Obviously, there are things like Guillain-Barré, which is like an ascending paralysis that have been seen in many different types of vaccines at what public health people say would be an acceptable rate. There are all kinds, there was some reports of Bell's palsy with some of the vaccines. The main point, I guess, to understand is that the risk of developing something new, like a year from now, is actually going to be minimal. That doesn't negate the side effects that are happening at the current time. But most of the time, almost always, when there is a side effect, it happens within the first 6 weeks. And which is part of the reason why I waited so long, is because I wanted to I wasn't necessarily concerned of, I wasn't going to wait a year, because in general, when you think about vaccine side effects, you're either going to get them soon or you're not going to get any sort of long-term effects. Is it possible? Is it theoretically possible that there could be some kind of side effect that only starts a year from now? The answer is, of course, there is. But if you look at the history of vaccination, almost always the side effect, if it's going to happen, is going to happen literally within the first 6 weeks. Okay, now let's talk a little bit. This is a little bit of a deep dive, but I really think it's important because people who are against vaccines use these numbers and people who are for vaccines use these numbers. And it's going to be up to you to really look at these numbers yourself. And I truly do believe that you're capable of making an educated decision on this. Most healthcare public policy experts often don't like to discuss these numbers because it makes it look like it's not as effective as you would think it is. In other words, when they say a virus is 90-something% effective, what exactly does that mean? And by the end of this section of tonight's talk, you're going to understand that. So you're going to have to be patient with me on this because it requires some numbers. But I think it's really going to pay off because this is how modern science uses numbers. And most people just don't understand it. And you'll realize that, again, when you're given a medication or you're watching a TV commercial, those commercials from the drug companies, which drive me absolutely insane, where they say this, medicine has a 75%, reduction in risk for, XYZ or whatever the case is. What exactly does that 75% or that 95% actually mean? All right, this looks scary, but just bear with me, okay? So the first example here, all right, we have a hypothetical example. Let me just look at our time, okay. So the hypothetical example is 20% of some group who weren't treated had a bad outcome. You could say that it was, 20% of people say caught an infection, or 20% of people had developed a disease or something of that sort. And 12% of people, same, we're talking about a study now, just a hypothetical example, 12% of people treated had a bad outcome. So 20%, so if they didn't get the treatment, 20% suffered. If they got the treatment, 12% suffered. So the absolute risk reduction here is 8%. In other words, 20 minus 12. So your reduction in risk is really 8%. And if you looked at it, if it was 100 people, 8 people would have been prevented from the bad outcome. So that makes sense to you, right? But how many times have you heard of a TV commercial where they say that it's an 8% reduction in risk. Now they don't say that, not because it sounds bad, although that might be part of it, because who's going to want to take a medication where, if you're talking to a patient and you say to them, this gives you an 8% reduction in risk, most people are not going to understand how these numbers are calculated. And they're going to say 8% reduction in risk. Forget it. I don't, but you have to take account the side effects. What are the side effects of these medicines? 8% up, maybe I won't take it. Okay. So let's keep on going, because we want to understand the relative risk, um, and we want to talk about the number needed to treat. In other words, how many people do you need to give the medicine in order to see some effect? Okay, so we understand what the absolute risk reduction is, but what the drug companies are going to communicate, not only to the population at large, but to themselves, is what the relative risk reduction is. In other words, how much compared to the control group, not compared to the 100 people, but how much compared to the control group. So the relative risk is measured like this. It's 12 divided by 20. So we've got 12 and 20. So we got 0.6. So generally speaking, if it's above 1, right? In other words, if this was reversed, then bad outcomes were increased by treatment. If they're below 1, there's a better income. So in other words, if it's 2, the bad outcome is twice as likely. So we're obviously looking for something that's going to be less than 1. Now, this to me is also important, because you're going to see relative risk as this type of number in any medical study that you're going to, a lot of you, I know, looking at the list of people tonight who I've spoken to, a lot of you do your own PubMed searches, and you look at the conclusions, but it would be nice if you understood how this number is actually calculated. Now, really, what they communicate in this case, when they're communicating not only to doctors, but to the population at large, is the relative risk reduction. So we talked about absolute risk reduction. In this case, 8%, right? 20 minus 12. That's that's really what your risk reduction is. But relative risk is going to be 1 minus 0.6, or a 40% reduction in a situation. So which sounds better, 40% or 8%? Well, obviously 40% sounds a whole lot better than 8%. So this is what they do. And then if we were to divide this 8% reduction, then we could see that this treatment needs 12, roughly 13 people to be able to see one positive reduction. One person basically have one less person having a bad outcome. In this particular case, you would need to give roughly 13 people the treatment. 12 of those people, it wouldn't do anything to them, but 1 out of the 13 would have a decrease in their bad outcome. So this brings to the fore the idea of, what are the potential side effects of any treatment. And that's why number needed to treat is often something that you can look for in certain studies, especially if you're going to go on a medication or you're evaluating studies. This allows you to be able to calculate how many people actually need to get, say, in this case, the vaccine, in order for one person to be able to not get, say, COVID. Okay, so now we're going to go into, I hope generally you understand that. And I think this is going to be revelatory, but again, people are going to look at this in different ways. As a physician, well, let me go through the numbers, and then you can get a general idea of what we're looking at. So this is a Pfizer study early on, okay? And so there were 40,000 subjects, and 20% had the vaccine, and 20,000 had the placebo vaccine. It's probably saline or something like that. And in the 20,000 that got the placebo vaccine, there were 86 cases of COVID, and there were 8 cases of in the vaccine. So the number of cases went from 86 to 8. Now, there are a lot of ways you could look at this. People who are against vaccines in general are going to say, well, I mean, 20,000 people, you know, 20,000 people, that's a lot, but there's only 86 cases. I'll just go with not, hopefully not getting it, because not as many people as you would expect maybe got it. That's sort of the situation. So okay, so I'm not going to be able to go to a link, Jen, but you can. I'm happy to. You have my email, so you can send it to me. Okay, so you have a 0.0043 and then 0.004. In other words, 8 over 20,000 and 86 over 20,000. All right, so the absolute relative risk is a 0.39%. Okay, and the relative risk is 0.039. In other words, 1 minus 0.039 is 90% reduction. So in this early study showed a 90% reduction. That's basically how they got to this number. But the actual reduction in risk, if you're one of these 40,000 people, the risk to you went down by 0.39%. Now, in this particular scenario, we'll review the most recent numbers, but the number needed to treat in this particular example would be 256 people, which basically means that 256 people would have to be vaccinated for one person to not get COVID. The latest data says for Pfizer it's 95%, which basically means a little bit less than 1%. In other words, your risk, your absolute risk, right, if you're in the larger population, believe it or not, is going to be less than 1%. Now that sounds like, what's the point of even getting the vaccine? But the point is that it's basically, you really need to look at the difference between this sort of thing. So you can see why, some people can legitimately say that it just doesn't make sense to me. But I believe, generally speaking, that, I've chosen to get vaccinated because I've certainly known younger people who are at the epitome of health, who have had some very, very peculiar long-term side effects to what seemed to be relatively innocuous early on course of COVID. And there have been some studies out of Europe to show something similar. Whether that risk, what those numbers are, is a different story. Moderna vaccine, which is 94.1% versus 95%, again, is working on numbers similar to this, where, maybe out of 20,000, it's going from, 100, to 4, that 100 to 6, in other words. But in the case of the overall population, if you're one of these 40,000 people, your absolute risk, believe it or not, is actually just reduced by 1.2%. And just interesting, your absolute risk reduction with the J&J is actually a little bit higher, even though it's 66.3% in terms of the relative risk. The absolute risk is 1.7%. So if you look at this number, it looks almost more effective if you're one of the huge population in that case. And in this case, the number needed to treat is going to be a lot smaller. So it's going to be it's going to be smaller. So again, all of these things play a role into the decision for people to be able to make, an educated decision in regards to whether or not they're going to get vaccinated or not. And I think, to a lot of people, this is a revelation. But this is how modern medicine looks at numbers. And there's nothing wrong with these numbers. In other words, just because the absolute risk reduction is 1.7% doesn't necessarily mean that it is something that you want to avoid. You have to sort of understand these numbers in a little bit of a deeper way. And I think the best way is to look at it from this perspective, have a general, do your own research in terms of side effects, and then understand the perspective of people who are in public health, which we'll get into next. Okay, let's close this down. So I hope that's been revelatory, because I hope it makes you look at just how science has to come up with science progresses in small statistical increases. That's just how science progresses. There are general guidelines when it comes to understanding what a statistical improvement is. And those can be very, very small, but what they call statistically significant. And science progresses and medications progress on what sounds like very small incremental increases. And truthfully, that's what it is. But if the general numbers are statistically significant, then you need to have a general understanding. Well, how many people what are the side effects? How many people need to be treated for one person to be prevented from death, or for one person to, the vaccines, the risks for vaccines, of course, are real. So that has to be taken into account when you are making these decisions for yourself. Now, the public health policy experts are basically going to say that they want 80% of the population vaccinated. Now, one of the things that herd immunity that I always like to say that always confuses me about this particular pandemic is that, unfortunately, public policy people haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about prevention and treatment of the disease. Everything has been focused on vaccination. And there have been studies around the world that have done all kinds of things about treatment. Now, early on, there was all kinds of things going on about different treatments. Unfortunately, those became politicized. And unfortunately, some of that research now is tainted with some crazy political connotation. I myself was having a conversation with someone just a couple of days ago, specifically about ivermectin, which does appear to have some impact. And somehow in this person's mind, it was somehow associated with Trump, and therefore was unable to have a rational discussion about the science behind ivermectin. These are the sorts of problems that we're dealing with in general. 30% generally, surveys generally show around 30% of people don't want to get the vaccine. And interestingly, France has the highest number of people who choose not to get vaccinated. Now, I am of the opinion that if you don't want to get vaccinated, you shouldn't get vaccinated. You should have the choice, but you should also know that there are 500,000 people or so in the population that can't get the vaccine, whether they're on a medication or they're getting chemotherapy or whatever the case may be. And public health experts will advise you that they don't think you should put these people at risk. And therefore, everyone should be vaccinated. That's their opinion. I believe that if you choose not to get vaccinated, you should realize that it is possible that you could put someone else at risk, but ultimately it's your body, and that you need to be able to make that decision by yourself, for you and for your family, understanding both the numbers, the side effects, and the potential risks of getting COVID. And when you put all those together, I truly believe that people, if they understand all the things that we've spoken about today, can make a rational decision when it comes to getting the vaccine. Now, if you're a physician and you're interacting with people who potentially could be at risk, then it probably makes sense in those particular situations that it should be mandated at the workplace for people who are interacting with some of these 500,000 people who can't get the vaccine, because we know that you can be infected and be shedding the virus and not be symptomatic. But for the rest of the population, again, I hope to have shed some more light. There are definitely people who don't know about the risks to other people, who don't have an understanding of the side effects, who just think, my risk of death is low, so I'm just gonna, ride it out and put myself possibly at getting the infection. For those people, I would say that if you're metabolically healthy and you're young and you don't have any risk factors, the risk of death is very, very low. The one thing that bothers me are the reports of these sort of very unusual neuropsychiatric side effects from getting the virus, that happened even in young, healthy people. So what I wanted to accomplish tonight maybe is just for everyone to get a little bit of a clearer understanding of what the numbers are, what the side effects, what the types of vaccines are, so you have a general understanding, and then also to have an understanding of what public policy health experts suggest. And that I hope that from talking about it in this way, that you have a general idea of what you want to do. Now, there's no question that there are some side effects to the vaccines, but for myself, for the decision that I made for myself and for my parents and my other family members, the risk was low enough to be able to feel comfortable getting the vaccine. For you, you have to make that decision for yourself. It's not my role to push that on you, but for me and for my family, I felt that it was a low enough risk to be able to take the vaccine, especially with say the state of Israel that did it, vaccinated a whole lot of people before everyone else, followed those numbers pretty carefully, but always there's risks. So hopefully you have a better understanding of how those risks and such are numbered, and you really have to look at it and make your own decision. So that concludes tonight's episode. I appreciate for your attendance. Jen, you can send me a link to the two comments that you made. I'd be happy to make a comment on them. I think that, as I said, there are, anyway, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, and hope everyone else enjoyed tonight's episode. Have a great night. Bye-bye.